And with that, and recording is in progress. Excellent. Thank you, Hannah. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it to my colleague, Elizabeth Fournier, who joined the team at CRPC, I believe, 3 months ago as our International Engagement and Dialogues Coordinator. She'll give a little bit of background on the United Nations framework for the Convention on Climate Change and why it's relevant to our climate actions and advocacy at the local level. Elizabeth, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sherry. So I'm just going to share screen and thank you everyone for being here. I think it's really important call. And I'm really glad that we have Rachel today. So I think that you can all see my screen now. Can you? Great. Okay. So I'm just going to put a little bit of context of like why fossil fuel is like an important issue, like from the global level to like the local level. So kind of in a nutshell, and I think that you kind of all already know, but fossil fuel is the main driver of climate change. And so the IPCC, and I don't know if you all know the IPCC, but it's kind of the body of like like so when the IPCC talks, it's like really the scientific community like worldwide talking. And so the IPCC said that it's 86% of global CO2 emissions over the past 10 years that came from fossil fuels. So, and that to the IAE also, so the International Energy Agency, that's to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. So, what's really important to be able to reduce global warming, fossil fuel demand must drop by over 25% by 2030. And right now, the demand is still growing. So, that's not where we are heading. And so to be able to kind of, respect the Paris Agreement objectives to reduce limit global warming to 1.5 or 2 degree, we need a rapid, like extremely rapid reduction of fossil fuel, the demand side and also the production side, like from all like in the supply chain. Um, and so that's kind of an overview also of gas, oil, and coal, and how in the past years their demand has been like exponentially growing worldwide. So fitting with globalization as well, and we can see like those three, so gas, oil, and coal being kind of the three horsemen of the apocalypse, kind of what we're seeing now. And so the IEE is like clearly saying that to be able to, fit with the objectives of the Paris Agreement, we need to drastically reduce the use and the demand of coal, oil, and fossil gas, and to increase the renewable energy the sources, but also to decrease demand energy to be able to fit with the Paris Agreement objectives. So now that I've kind of set the stage of fossil fuel being the main driver of climate change, how has fossil fuel have or have not been talked about in the 30 years of climate international negotiations? So the thing is, in the past 25, 30 years, okay, I'll just go like chronologically. So, and the UNFCCC and in 1992, so maybe you all know, but with the Rio de Janeiro conventions, summit creating the three like main conventions, so on biodiversity, desertification, and climate. So it's the framework on climate change. So there's one mention of fossil fuel, but it's only to acknowledge the impacts of response measures that may have effects on economies depending on them. So there's kind of implicit already in 1992 of like the fact that leaving fossil fuel might be one of the response measures to climate change. Paris Agreement 2015, there's like a new international regime with the Paris Agreement. It makes no direct reference to fossil fuels. So we kind of see that in the like first 25 years of international negotiations, like the first 25 COPs, they were kind of absent or really like just implicitly mentioned, despite being at the heart of the problem. Asia, yeah, you have a question.
There was just a comment in the chat if you could speak a bit slower, if that's all right.
Yeah, of course, of course. I always
Thank you.
speak like really fast, and
No worries.
since it's not my first language, I can understand. Maybe it's gonna be, yeah. I'll try to slow it down. Thank you for noticing. And if you have any questions about what I'm seeing, like don't hesitate also to write in the chat or raise your hand. So yeah, basically 25 first COP, no big mention of fossil fuel. That kind of changed in Glasgow. So at COP26 with the Glasgow Pact, it was kind of the first mention in a cover decision of fossil fuel. So there was discussions because it was like really like the most vulnerable countries and civil society like driving those discussions for for years. But it took a long time and for different reasons I don't have time to get into, like why did the parties like not really get into that sooner. But at COP26 at Glasgow, that's where the parties decided to decide upon the accelerating efforts toward the phase down of unabated coal power. Just in that, you can already see like some issues popping up. There is phase down instead of phase out. So the language is really something that's highly debated. And I'm going to touch upon that a bit later. But oh, sorry. I think maybe we could. Yeah, perfect. And unabated also like how when the term unabated it's references to like CSC and carbon storage technology. And that's also like an issue that's really interesting because that's how industry kind of use the fact that they can still produce oil and gas, but if they kind of just put, like CSC technology in it, then all it's going to be good, but it's not that pink. And coal power was kind of the only one at the beginning that was mentioned. And so also phasing out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies was also brought upon. At COP27, the year after, there was no more ambitious language on the phase out of fossil fuel, but there was like really like parties were kind of still, some parties wanted more language than that, some not. And that's where we had the proposition by Vanuatu and Tuvalu of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty that Rachel is going to talk to you about in a bit. And also Colombia pledged to end oil and gas exploration and extraction, which was kind of, it's a big deal because Colombia is one of the most like kind of the like a big producer. And so usually the big producers do not want to do those pledges or to have like strong language. COP28, so 2023, that's kind of where the world was like, woohoo, we kind of, and that's kind of a headline that was at the time, that COP28 agreement marks the beginning of the end of the fossil fuel era, which I think people that wrote that maybe this year just maybe not agreeing with themselves, or I don't know. Anyway, so at COP28, with the outcomes of the first global stocktake, there was this big decision that you already know about, maybe, but to transition away from fossil fuels in energy systems in a just, orderly, and equitable manner. And I'm not gonna go too much into the details, but it's like it's like a subparagraph of paragraph 28, and unfortunately, some countries take those subparagraphs like kind of a grocery list where they can like pick and choose which subparagraphs works the most for them. So like Saudi Arabia right now is just saying like we want to focus on CSC and like we don't have to do the transition away from fossil fuels, and we can just like focus on different subparagraphs. And I don't have too much time, but I'm just kind of just giving you an overview, just to kind of say, yeah, also like the language is, as I was saying, like really something that's highly debated. And so that's why civil society in general, they kind of, we push for more like strong language to phase out and not phase down, because phase out is really like more ambitious. It's really a question of, really removing and being able to move to other like energy sources, versus phase down is kind of just reducing. COP29 last year, it was a COP on finance. And so the thing is like, and that's kind of one of the issues with the transition away from fossil fuels, that not all countries have the same means and to do that. And so how do we do it in a just and inequitable manner? Well, we need finance, but right now the finance is not sufficient. I will pass it because we're kind of already at time. So kind of just, it was just kind of to give you an overview of how the fossil fuel issue was treated in COPs. And so beginning, at COP 30 this year, we don't really expect, I mean, most of us don't really expect like a more ambitious language this year because of how multilateralism is going. But there is still calls from civil society and some countries who really want to really like follow up on with that. And that's why it's so nice to have Rachel, because it's really how we can see that civil society, and like that has been, like in the literature, which we see how civil society pushing this issue forward was one of the reasons, one of the main reasons historically that like countries and parties in COPs have decided to, pass those agreements and to kind of, for subsidies or for a transition away from fossil fuel. It's really like we need civil society to mobilize and to get to make a government know that it's an important issue for us. So in that respect, I will now pass it. And I mean, if you have any questions about how it was treated, like it's really big, and there's like really different contentious issues that the parties are like trying to agree upon. But I feel like Rachel is going to be the better person for really seeing how you can take all of that and like push it in your local level to make it able to like have really like collective call worldwide. So I'll pass it back to Sherry, and I'll have also to leave this call unfortunately at 3:30. But it was just really nice to be able to connect with all of you, and I'm looking forward also to have other occasions in the future. So I'll stop sharing and giving it back to Sherry so you can introduce Rachel. There we go.
Yeah, thank you so much for giving us that background context, Elizabeth. And I just want to, yeah, echo the sentiment that although these negotiations seem really high level and off somewhere far away from us, like it really is the people that are pushing for this work to move forward at home and for phase out to move forward at home that is what is achieving some of the language that we're hoping to get and how we get these really high level negotiations across that finish line. So with that, I'm really happy to introduce our guest presenter for this call, Rachel Ruback, the North America Project Manager for the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. So Rachel joins us today from Washington, D.C. on Piscataway lands. Her work focuses on developing the treaty's presence across North America and highlighting how this campaign fits within a broader global effort to phase out fossil fuels in a fair and equitable way. Rachel's role also supports deeper civil society engagement within multilateral forums, ensuring that the voices from communities, organizations, and movements are represented where the decisions get made. So with that, Rachel, you have the floor.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm so grateful to be here with all of you today and to share a bit more about the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty campaign and proposal. And thank you to Elizabeth for that really comprehensive overview of how fossil fuels have shown up in international forums so far. You're making my job a little bit easier in terms of what I have to share. So let me get the slideshow pulled up. Can everyone see it? Okay. Great. So I guess just really quickly before I get into it, would you mind giving me like a show of hands or a thumbs up in some way if you've heard of the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative before? Okay. Okay, great. Good to know that we've managed to get on some of your radars so far. It's quite exciting. So yeah, as Elizabeth mentioned, right now, global plans to phase out fossil fuels are quite inadequate, and we don't really have the international cooperation or infrastructure in place necessary to phase out fossil fuel production. Like she said, it's responsible for 80% of carbon emissions. And so fossil fuels are really one of the key drivers of the climate crisis, but they're also a key driver of a lot of other interrelated crises, from air pollution to biodiversity loss to water quality in communities around fossil fuel production sites, but also like oil spills impact the acidification of the oceans, right? Like they're connected to so many of these interrelated climate and environmental crises that we're fighting in communities across the world. And despite having known that for decades, currently the world is on track to produce 120% more fossil fuels than is consistent with limiting climate change to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is the goal laid out in the Paris Agreement. And, you know, even if we could do fossil fuel production in a way that wasn't driving global warming, that extraction still would be poisoning communities, leading to air pollution, hurting biodiversity around the world. So there's a lot of really critical reasons to phase out fossil fuel production. And right now, the plans are just not there to actually do that. And all of that is true despite investment into renewable energy. And I think that that's really important to highlight. We've seen a lot of investment into renewable energy in the past couple of decades, thanks in part to agreements like the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC. But right now, there's still a lot of demand for fossil fuels. And that's in part because I think we're often used to seeing, you know, in like the simple supply and demand charts that, oh, well, if demand goes down, supply will go down. And one of the problems with fossil fuels is that that simple logic just doesn't apply here. If the fossil fuel industry produces fossil fuels, they are going to want to generate demand for those fossil fuels. They have invested into the extraction. Now they're going to want to market for those fossil fuels, which means that they're using their lobbying power to prevent local communities from transitioning their energy systems away from fossil fuels. They're using their power to prevent countries from moving their energy systems, but also their economies away from fossil fuel use and production. They're using all of the power available to them to make sure that we stay reliant on fossil fuels, because fossil fuels are quite profitable for them. And if they produce the fossil fuels, they're going to want to market for them. And so investing into renewable infrastructure, while incredibly important, is not actually enough to really reduce demand for fossil fuel production. To do that, we need actual international cooperation, creating agreements and international mechanisms that would help countries to move their economies away from fossil fuel production, to move their energy systems away from fossil fuel use, and to do so in a way that doesn't hurt communities that are on the front lines in a variety of different ways. And so we need an international agreement around fossil fuel production specifically to address the climate crisis and make sure that we still have access to the energy that we need, and to deal with the historical harms of the fossil fuel industry. And right now, there just isn't really a global agreement on fossil fuel production risks and the associated ways that it impacts our environment and our economies. And so there's a lot of harms from that, but we have the ability to create this type of international agreement in order to address these various different types of harms. We just have to really take specifically into account some of the problems that are associated with fossil fuels, which we can get into more later if there's interest. But just to say that phasing out fossil fuels is not, it's not as simple as just like turning off the spigot. And that's not what we're suggesting that we do, is say like, well, just stop it tomorrow, because we recognize that it's more complicated, and fossil fuels are really interwoven into so many parts of our economies and our lives. And so we need really thoughtful, comprehensive plans to do so, to phase out fossil fuel production in a way that it leads to the best outcomes for communities and countries, and does what we need to do to address their impact on climate change. And so, yeah, as Elizabeth mentioned, the Paris Agreement doesn't really mention fossil fuels in the text itself, and it's taken until the last couple of years for them to come up in some of the outcomes of the Paris Agreement, or of the COPs that are held every year. And so, yeah, so in order to address this gap in international policy, the Pacific Islands were the first to call for a treaty that would ban fossil fuels. And the proposal that has come out of their leadership has 3 pillars. So just to clarify, right now, there isn't a fossil fuel treaty text that will be negotiated by countries. But the proposal for a fossil fuel treaty really focuses on international cooperation to address these 3 areas. A just transition, so making sure that there is technical and financial support to help nations that are interested in reducing fossil fuel production do so, in order to make sure that the transition is just for the workers of the industry, communities on the front lines of fossil fuel production, and countries' economies that have been reliant on fossil fuel production. And then the way that you do that is by having non-proliferation, so no new production of fossil fuels, and then a fair phase out of existing production on a level of urgency necessary to meet the 1.5 degree limiting of warming goal that the Paris Agreement lays out. So those are the three main areas that we think a fossil fuel treaty would need to cover for it to mean that the goals that we have would be realized in the real world. Okay, so how do we actually win a treaty is a question. I think we all have a pretty good idea of how to influence local policy or even national policy, but how do we win a treaty? In order to come up with an answer to that, we had teams when this initiative first started who really tried to sit down and understand other treaties that have been negotiated as models. So that's everything from the Montreal Protocol and how we managed to address ozone depletion to the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which the treaty that preceded it, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, is where we have borrowed the name from in our campaign, to a couple of other treaties. And a couple of things that I want to pull out from this slide. First is that you'll see in this Montreal Protocol, you only really need around 20 nations at the start to kickstart a global movement. And the Montreal Protocol did manage to effectively address ozone depletion. And it started with just 20 nations that were ready to get moving. So you don't really have to wait until you have every country on board to get started. And the way that a lot of these treaties worked was by having a small group of high ambitious countries create a really ambitious text as a way to start setting global norms and then pull more and more countries in to that, rather than starting from the agreement that would be most likely to be acceptable to all countries. One of the reasons that it's hard to get certain types of language into something like the Paris Agreement is because in the UNFCCC process, you need consensus between all countries, which means that countries that really want to maintain fossil fuels can be blocker countries there, but you don't have to negotiate treaties through those same types of processes that require consensus between all countries. And then another thing that I want to pull out from this that I think we'll get into a little bit more later on is that one of the ways that you build the diplomatic support for a treaty is through having civil society support, but also by having subnational government support. So in the case of nuclear weapons, a lot of cities and states and provinces around the world started declaring themselves nuclear-free zones. And the more that happened, the more it showed that there was demand from communities to not have nuclear weapons in or near their communities, and that helped to build the diplomatic pressure. And a similar thing happened with the mine ban treaty. One other lesson that I want to pull out from the mine ban treaty that I think may be interesting since this is a group of Canadians on this call, is that the mine ban treaty process really kicked off with Canada just deciding that they were going to go ahead. They called the first meeting. The mine ban treaty is often called the Ottawa process. And it was just the Canadian government that said, we would like to kickstart a process to deal with landmine use. And so they held a conference, they invited countries to it, and they kicked off a process that pretty quickly led to the negotiation of a landmine ban across the world. And so yeah, it really can take leadership from one country that's ready to get going. And actually Canada is the one that showed us that. So yeah, there's a lot of really great lessons to learn from past treaties for how we get a fossil fuel treaty negotiated. So like I said, it takes us a group of around 20 to really get started. And we're at 17 countries that have formally called or joined the call for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. Tuvalu and Vanuatu were two of the first. It grew to a lot of additional Pacific islands and Caribbean islands have been really strong in this block, given that small island states are really on the front lines of climate change. But then we also have Colombia actually as one of our largest producers or as the largest producer in this block, and they have been demonstrating a ton of leadership on fossil fuel phase out recently, and I'll get into that a bit more later. But yeah, so we are nearing the size of a negotiation block that in past treaty efforts has allowed for a treaty negotiation process to get started, which is quite exciting, which means that we're approaching a new phase of this treaty campaign, which I'll get into a bit more in a bit. And then we also have a ton of support from all sorts of other different stakeholder groups around the world. Like 3,800 civil society organizations and businesses have formally endorsed, 11 indigenous nations. I think this number has grown now. It's closer to 140 cities and subnational governments, a million individuals, 800 parliamentarians, scientists, academics, banks. Like the types of stakeholders that we have engaged in this is quite expansive. Faith communities. Yeah, there's a lot of folks that are joining this global campaign for a fossil fuel treaty. So, like I said, we're reaching a new phase in the campaign, which is really exciting. This is sort of the fossil fuel treaty theory of change. You start by building the movement. That's growing the campaign, building support from different stakeholder groups, expanding the research and evidence base to demonstrate that phasing out fossil fuels in this way is even possible, and really starting to stigmatize fossil fuels. I think really taking on the social and political license of the fossil fuel industry is really critical, which we hope that this movement is helping to do. And it's been so great to see the rise of like make polluter pay style campaigns that are really trying to hold fossil fuel companies responsible, or campaigns that try to ban ads for the fossil fuel industry, given that they have a history of lying about the health harms of their products. So yeah, really stigmatizing the fossil fuel industry. And then you start to build the political buy-in, and you get that first mover group of countries. Like I said, ours is currently at 17, but then also UN agencies. So the World Health Organization has endorsed, the UN Secretary General has endorsed. Just last week, I was in Abu Dhabi, and for the World Conservation Congress of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And that is a group of 1,400 conservationist organizations, countries, subnational governments, indigenous peoples, civil society that meet every year or every couple of years to set norms in the world of biodiversity and conservation. And at the World Conservation Congress in Abu Dhabi, they passed a motion calling for a fossil fuel non-proliferation and recognizing the impact of fossil fuels on biodiversity. So building support in some of these like parallel multilateral forums is really important. And then you get to the point where you're formalizing the multilateral process. And so that's deciding, are you going to negotiate inside the UN or outside of the UN? What type of negotiating modality are you going to use? Is this, what types of what types of mechanisms might go into each of those three pillars of the treaty that I mentioned earlier. And we're nearing this phase of the campaign. Colombia earlier last month announced that they will be hosting the first ever international diplomatic conference on fossil fuel phase out in April, which is really exciting. They're going to be bringing countries together to really start talking about what it will take to phase out fossil fuels. And one of the things that will be discussed at that conference is what type of modality might be used for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, which is really exciting. So then you have the multilateral process is formalized, negotiations start happening, and during the negotiations, civil society and other stakeholders push for the negotiations to be as ambitious as possible, advise countries and support their diplomats through additional research or other means, try to pull new countries into the negotiation block. And then once a treaty has been negotiated, pushing for it to be ratified in countries. And then you start to hold countries accountable to what they said they were going to do. So those are sort of the 5 phases. And we're starting to transition from that second phase into the third phase, which is quite exciting. So just quickly to say that, like I said, there is part of the strategy is that you start with this like first mover group of countries. You start on the most ambitious note possible. That's vulnerable non-producers, but then also small to mid producers. And there's ways in which they still can form a pretty powerful block that can start to set global norms and push other countries to join the conversation in a particular way. And then sort of they're the ones who are most likely to be out in front. And then once a process really gets started, you can pull in those second movers who might not be the ones to push for a treaty, but would show up to the negotiation table. And one thing to note is that probably we don't want blocker countries to be involved in the process too early. So that could mean the US definitely right now, but Canada potentially as well, and other high income producer countries. The goal isn't necessarily to get them to join the negotiation block right away. And so how we think about the role of North America in a treaty campaign is a bit different than how we think about the role of other regions. And I'll get into that a little bit more, but yeah, just wanted to flag here that in the US and Canada, my goal has not necessarily been to get the federal governments to join the negotiation block yet. Hopefully someday, but that's not quite how we think of our role in the campaign just yet. Okay, so went through a lot of folks that have endorsed. Just wanted to show that there already has been a lot of subnational engagement across Canada. A number of municipalities and cities around the country have endorsed. It's true of the US as well. And that diplomatic support from subnational governments across the US and Canada is really, really particularly useful in our context because our federal governments won't be showing up to the table. So being able to show that there are still political leaders, civil society, others on the ground in these two countries that have a ton of fossil fuel production and are responsible historically for a decent portion of carbon emissions, to show that there is support from within those countries can be quite useful when, you know, in the world of like international cooperation, you sort of have this problem often where there's a lot of incentive not to go first. And in particular to say, why should we if you're not going to? And that kind of energy can be directed at the US and Canada quite often when it comes to fossil fuels. And so signals like this coming from within the countries that there is momentum towards phasing out fossil fuels happening within the countries, even if it's not at the federal level, can be quite useful for trying to get around that problem and for then actually phasing out fossil fuels in these two countries. You know, like we do need to really start moving away from fossil fuel production here. And that is possible even if our federal governments aren't the ones making that decision, because they're not the only ones who have power in the countries. So yeah, there is a growing support from around Canada. There also is, I just wanted to flag that because, you know, we think of a just transition a bit more comprehensively than just the workers of the industries. You know, a just transition also means holding fossil fuel companies accountable for actual like decommissioning of fossil fuel infrastructure and restoration of the area around it. For the restoration for the health harms caused by fossil fuel production. You know, there's a lot of ways that communities are impacted beyond just the workers who live in them. But we definitely want workers to be a part of the conversation around a just transition. And so labor being involved in the campaign for a fossil fuel treaty is quite important. And a couple of Canadian labor unions have endorsed and actually were some of the early endorsers. The Fédération de Travailleurs et Travailleuses de Québec and then the Canadian Union of Postal Workers both have endorsed the treaty. And so, yeah, building labor support, including among workers who have been a part of the fossil fuel production or in other ways are have work that's dependent on fossil fuel use in some way is quite important for ensuring a just transition in the end. Okay, so maybe yeah. So like I said, there's a number of different ways that a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty campaign, that local action helps to build the campaign, and then ways that we hope that the existence of a fossil fuel treaty campaign happening could help to advance actual efforts happening on the ground. So local efforts build the campaign by creating that diplomatic pressure, by raising the profile of the need to phase out fossil fuels as part of the conversation around climate change, but also within biodiversity and other spaces. So this local campaign, yeah, Sherry?
Yeah, we just have a clarifying question in the
Yeah,
chat just before you dive into your examples.
no worries.
Um, so Dora's just asking if the Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty focuses on no new fossil fuel projects. Is that like, is it just initially, or is that the whole of the treaty?
So yeah, great question. So let me, here, I can go back to the 3 pillars. So the idea
That's
is
great.
a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty would need to do all 3 of these things. So you would have countries agreeing to end fossil fuel production starting now, hopefully, so no new projects moving forward. Um, and then phasing out existing production. And the hope would be that, in addition to phasing out, that includes like decommissioning the projects and yeah, dealing with the consequences of that fossil fuel production, cleaning up the industrial pollution, et cetera. And then yeah, a just transition. So making sure that the impacts on communities and economies that have been dependent on fossil fuels, that like mitigating that impact as much as possible. Does that make sense? Are there other clarifying questions on that? I'm happy to hold here for one more second before I move on. Sorry, I just can't see the
Yeah,
chat presenting.
thanks. Yeah, no, I just appreciate you bringing us back to the slide
Yeah.
and recognizing that although maybe the initial stage is about stopping all new projects, that it is about shutting uh, all the fossil fuels down. Yeah,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
that's great.
And just maybe one more thing I'll say while we're back here, so thank you for bringing us back, is that part of the whole need for a fossil fuel treaty is that it does need to be more than just ending new production going forward, and
Right.
that in order for that to happen well, we need an actual plan. Like there needs to be a really thoughtful plan in place for how we're going to do that, because fossil fuels are so integrated into so many economies, not always by the choice of the countries. There's opening your fossil fuel assets to international investors has been a condition of IMF loans for many countries around the world. And so just saying that like the access to fossil fuels or the reliance on fossil fuel production has not always been the choice of the communities that are on the front lines of that extraction. And if we were to just say, well, no new fossil fuels starting tomorrow, that would have an economic impact on a lot of communities. And, there are places that fossil fuels are going to be harder to reduce our demand for. And so there's places where it's really easy to say, like, well, we should just in cities, we should invest more in public transportation that runs on electricity. But there's other places where reducing demand for fossil fuels is going to be a bit harder. And so we've seen in so many communities across Canada and the US for sure, that when industry lead a transition on their own industry, it doesn't go well for communities. Usually they're not taking the needs of the local communities into account. They're not doing so in a way that that avoids some of these economic issues. I mean, oil refineries are starting to close in several communities across the US in a way that is just like one day they're there, the next day they're not. And that has like tax revenue implications for local communities. They're not decommissioning the oil refinery infrastructure. And so to do a transition away from fossil fuels well, we need a really intentional plan that takes into account the needs of so many different stakeholder types. And so companies are not going to come up with that plan on their own. And so part of the idea of the fossil fuel treaty is that we're trying to make that plan, and we're trying to engage all the voices necessary in the creation of that plan.
Thank you. That's great detail. Appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks for, missed saying that earlier. So thank you for bringing us back here. Okay, so then I will just hop back forward quickly to just talk a little bit more about, so yeah, there's ways that local action helps to build the diplomatic campaign to win a treaty, but the hope would also be that by creating this space to talk about exactly this, the need for a plan for how to transition away from fossil fuels, the ability to directly call out the historical harms of the fossil fuel industry, we can then generate the space to have more ambitious action on the ground in local communities. I think one way to maybe think about this is that, even for a long time, even in communities that were thinking about climate change, what exactly is the goal? What is the benchmark? What are we fighting for? They would have different ideas of that. The Paris Agreement created a unified goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius that creates a benchmark that you can weigh your local climate action plan against this international benchmark by having IPCC reports that get released on a regular frequency. There's now a really great library of scientific research on how climate change functions and impacts communities that gives local communities more information that can be used to help create their plans. And so part of the hope is that a fossil fuel treaty would do a similar thing for fossil fuel phase out. It would create mechanisms that countries and local communities could access to actually help finance the phase out. It would create technical assistance for communities. It would create benchmarks to best understand like how, to what degree, on what time scale, et cetera. So there's a lot of different ways that we hope that the text of the fossil fuel treaty, the actual treaty itself, would benefit local communities. And in the meantime, that a campaign explicitly naming fossil fuels as a key driver of the climate crisis and as a source of a ton of harm for our communities, it creates space to push for more ambitious local action. And so these are a couple of examples that were pulled together by Sophia, who is at Stand.Earth. She is their treaty campaigner right now. And so, in British Columbia, after 10 municipalities endorsed the treaty, they were persuaded to adopt ambitious building decarbonization policies. In Los Angeles, they unanimously passed a ban on new drilling a year after the city endorsed the fossil fuel treaty. And in Austin, Texas, they began new municipal community solar incentive program as a commitment to supporting more renewables. And Austin, Texas also has endorsed the treaty, and that was particularly notable because Austin, Texas is in the heart of fossil fuel country. And in the US, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania have both endorsed in the last year, and they are also major cities in the heart of fossil fuel country in the US and are places that have experienced the impact of industry-led transitions of economies, and so have joined the block of countries pushing, or the block of municipalities pushing for fossil fuels, in part because they recognize the need for like really intentional community-oriented plans for how you transition away. So all of these are examples of ways that, so all three of these are places that have endorsed the fossil fuel treaty proposal and then have had more ambitious local action happen on fossil fuels. And I'm not exactly going to claim that like they only did each of these three policy things because of the fossil fuel treaty endorsement, but it is a way to raise the profile of fossil fuels with local elected officials. It is a way to build a local network that's really directly focused on fossil fuels, that's able to, after securing an endorsement commitment, then push for more tangible policies. It's a way to have a campaign that raises the profile of fossil fuels in a community. And so we hope that the Fossil Fuel Treaty campaign, in addition to like getting local endorsements in order to win a fossil fuel treaty, in reverse, the existence of the Fossil Fuel Treaty campaign can help us push for more tangible policies related to fossil fuels on the ground in our local communities. So right now, as I mentioned, Stand.Earth has a treaty campaigner right now who is building out treaty endorsement campaigns in a number of municipalities in Canada right now, but we would love to see this list of places that have municipal campaigns growing. And so if you're interested in pushing for a fossil fuel treaty endorsement in your community, we have a ton of resources that we can share with you on our website. There's a whole toolkit that includes a sample motion that you can bring to your city councils, templates of emails, and then a brief that you can give to city officials on endorse the fossil fuel treaty and what else, what other policies exist at the subnational level to take on fossil fuel production directly. And so, yeah, there's a number of ways you can get involved in the Fossil Fuel Treaty campaign. If you're interested, you can endorse as an individual or as an organization on our website, promote the treaty concept, join the constituency groups. Like I mentioned, we've got academics, faith leaders, so many different constituency groups. But in particular, calling on cities and subnational governments to endorse the treaty has such a high impact right now. If you want to push those local elected officials to get more involved in the campaign, we have a partnership with Parliamentarians for a Fossil-Free Future. And then, yeah, eventually, hopefully, we can start calling on our nations to join the actual negotiations of a fossil fuel treaty. And yeah, with that, I will take a breath and feel happy to answer any additional questions you have. That was a lot of information to throw at you. So thank you all for sitting through it.
Right on. Well, thank you so much, Rachel. I'm sorry to interrupt your taking a breath, but at this point, we're going to open up the floor to questions. But first, thank you for helping us better understand how the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty is evolving, and really excited to see how civil society and community groups can kind of play a role in shaping this work. So we'd love to keep the conversation going. So we're going to open up the floor to questions. We'll have around 10 minutes or so for this Q&A section. And yeah, feel free to raise your hand if you have any questions or drop them in the chat. Just to get the ball rolling, Margot Shepard has a great question in the chat about, is the treaty going to be the same text for all negotiating countries, or will there be tiers in the treaty? How do we see advocates in particular rolling this out?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And again, there's only so much concrete answer I can give about what will end up in the final text of the treaty because of the fact that it's ultimately up to countries to negotiate it. But, you know, even within the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC framework, we have the idea of common but differentiated responsibilities. And there are sort of different, and understanding that there is a different level of responsibility for historical emitters, for countries depending on the size of their economies and their ability to pay for a transition. And so there is, in the way that we think about different countries' obligations under the under the UNFCCC, there is the idea that there's a common responsibility, as in every country has a role to play in addressing the climate crisis, but there's differentiated responsibilities based on how impacted you are by the climate crisis, how dependent your economy is on climate causing industries, what is your historical emissions, and what is your ability to pay. And so I think there is an understanding that there would be sort of a similar, like, under a fossil fuel treaty, obviously, non-producing countries don't have obligations to end new fossil fuel projects. Maybe don't start, if you haven't started, don't start producing. But there would be potentially different parameters for producing countries and non-producing countries. There's ways that non-producing countries could be collectively using their demand for fossil fuels, moving away from like LNG imports, for example. So yeah, there is maybe not officially like tiers, but there are ways in which there might be mechanisms that are more applicable to some countries than others, and that there would be an understanding that certain countries have more of an obligation to move faster, for instance. And then, yeah, obviously, like producer versus non-producer countries would have slightly different like ways that they're interacting with the treaty. And then maybe the one additional thing I'll say on that before getting to Dora is just to say that one of the things that's really exciting about the moment that we're at, in that we're starting to see momentum towards a fossil fuel treaty being negotiated, is that we're at the moment where we can start crystallizing our demands. There's a chance right now to influence what will end up in that text. And so now is a really great time to start thinking about what would the most just and effective version of a fossil fuel treaty look like, and how can we push for that to be what the text ends up looking like. And in particular, from countries that have been responsible for a lot of historical production, what could we envision in our countries, and what standard could we envision holding our countries to, whether or not they're officially a part of the fossil fuel treaty or not.
And before we move on to Dora, who I see you have your hand up, I guess like in that vein of the text kind of starting to crystallize and raising ambition specifically through like municipal means, if your city has already signed on to the treaty or is thinking about it, like how can we as people in this call help in that and raise that ambition?
Yeah, I think that is a great question. And I think there's a couple of different ways to answer it. So I think pushing for subnational governments to be more ambitious. Quebec is a member of the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, BOGA. And so there are ways in which subnational governments do directly engage in international diplomacy, do directly make commitments along the lines of what's being discussed at the international level, and then hopefully actually start passing municipal level policies that align with that level of ambition. And so pushing for a higher level of ambition at subnational levels can be quite useful for helping to raise the level of ambition globally, especially in places where, some of our subnational governments govern over more fossil fuel production than entire countries do. And so that level of ambition and leadership from some national governments can go a long way in places that are producers. I think on the other side, we have so many great civil society advocacy groups and networks and coalitions and academics and others who have been thinking about these issues for a really long time. And so the production of really good research on what fossil fuel phase out could look like and what should go into that plan, and how do you actually feasibly phase out fossil fuels in our communities and globally, I think participating in the thought leadership around that can be quite useful. And then the third thing would be bringing more stakeholder voices into the conversation. I have been having some really great conversations recently with actually a group in Canada around how to get more farmers to be involved in the conversation, because agriculture is a sector that's really dependent on fossil fuels. And so having like good communication with farmers around what it might look like means that, okay, well, now we can produce a plan that's even better for a whole other sector. And so, yeah, bringing additional voices into the conversation.
Great. Thank you so much for that answer, Rachel. Dora, go ahead.
Great, thanks very much. And a lot of what you have said is supporting my question. So I'm looking for what are the benefits and the obligations of any municipality or state that would sign on to this. For example, it sounds like, at some level, they could participate in the text, uh, developing the text of the agreement, or they might benefit from the uh, education or knowledge of other groups. For example, what you were just talking about agriculture. So if I was an agricultural municipality, I might benefit from learning what others have done. And what are the obligations? Like, am I saying I'm a municipality, so I won't have any new oil and gas uh, projects on my in my municipality? Or those are my examples, but maybe you could come up with others. Thanks.
Yeah. So right now, endorsing the fossil fuel treaty is more of a symbolic endorsement. There are, the obligations are a bit more like moral obligations than legal obligations. Although, recently, I don't know how much all of you have followed the International Court of Justice's advisory opinion on climate change. So the ICJ advisory opinion says that countries have an obligation to phase out fossil fuels, essentially. Like, they directly name fossil fuels within the conversation on countries' obligations on climate change. And phasing out fossil fuel production is essential to being able to meet the 1.5 degree goals that countries are legally obligated to. And so failure to meaningfully address climate change is now could be considered an internationally wrongful act, right? And so, and I think that, like, we should be pushing to say that our understanding of this is that if a country has an obligation to do something, then all of its modes of government have that obligation, which means that subnational governments have an obligation to act in a way that aligns with the commitments that our countries have made. Like, just, just because federal governments signed the human rights treaties doesn't mean that subnational governments are allowed to violate our human rights. Like, that carries over. And so if we have a right to a healthy environment and fossil fuels threaten that, the international legal obligation to uphold our right to a healthy environment applies to subnational governments as well. And so, again, to say that, like, sure, passing a resolution endorsing the fossil fuel treaty is a symbolic endorsement, but I think that it should be part of a discussion for, in this era, like, how do we hold subnational governments accountable for our internationally recognized rights, and how do we create more of a sense of obligation at the local level? But yeah, that's a bit my thinking on we live in a world that is just more complicated than countries make decisions. When the UN system was negotiated or was designed, it was meant to be like diplomacy between nation states. But nation states are not the only place that important decisions are made, because now subnational governments, subnational governments make a lot of really important decisions. But we also live in a world where, like, multinational corporations have a lot of power. And so I think, like, we are in a really interesting moment of understanding what does it mean to actually realize human rights in the really complicated system that we live in. And I think we all need to be thinking a lot more about what role subnational governments have in that conversation. So I think the Fossil Fuel Treaty campaign is a really interesting place to have that conversation as well. That's not a direct answer to your question, though. They don't technically have obligations under it, except that if they say that ending fossil fuel production is important to realizing the right to a healthy environment and meeting climate change goals, well, now you have a way to say, like, okay, so do something about it. Like, you said this was important, do something about it. In terms of the benefits, I think the ones that you named right now are spot on. I think my hope would be that there would be additional avenues moving forward for subnational governments to participate in some of these like international negotiation processes. And like I mentioned before, I was just at the World Conservation Congress of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And that is a multilateral forum where subnational governments vote alongside state governments and indigenous peoples organizations and civil society for the resolutions that they pass, which was so interesting to see how all of that played out. And I think, you know, we would start to see more spaces operate like that if we had subnational leaders asking to have more of a voice, if we had more of them showing up as observers to the UNFCCC process, but also to an eventual fossil fuel treaty negotiation process, if they showed up in more places and said, we want a seat at the table, our decisions are impacted by what gets decided on here, mechanisms that get designed here. Like there's a way that subnational governments could participate in international financing mechanisms if they're designed that way. So then we need subnational leaders to be showing up to the table and saying, design them that way. Like we'll phase out. If you give us a way to participate in this, we could phase out fossil fuel production, even if our federal government doesn't ever officially sign the treaty. And so I think part of it is like, yeah, making those demands, asking for that to be true. And so we need to be pushing our subnational leaders to see themselves as folks with power at the international level in that way, and for them to be showing up to participate in this kind of like subnational diplomacy.
Really great, Rachel. Thank you. And can you leave in the chat or something the name of the organization that you were just in speaking about?
Yeah, it's a long
Thanks.
name. Yeah.
It is.
I know for a fact that I was having a really hard time saying Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty over and over again in my team meetings. So I don't blame you at all there, Dora. I guess last question. I know we're a little bit over time for the Q&A section, but in that same vein of, how do we mobilize for the FFNPT at the municipal level? I see that Donna is already doing some boots on the ground work and is working to rally supporters to help pass a motion at Mississauga City Hall. Can you, Rachel, maybe speak to, I don't know, the different tactics that you've kind of seen civil society or local activists take in getting the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty passed at the municipal level? Success stories, what has worked, what hasn't worked?
Yeah, so I think one thing that has most often worked is having an ally on the inside, having the one person in the city council that's really ready to champion it, and then supporting them as best as you can. And then, yeah, anticipating a bit like what priorities are being focused on right now and making sure that you have voices that are ready to speak to each of those priorities. So you listed a bunch of different constituency groups here, and that's really great. But, if you live in a place that there's a lot of focus right now on water quality, then having someone who can speak to the intersection of fossil fuels and water quality is quite useful. So thinking about what's sort of like already on the minds of city councilors, what are some of the big priorities locally, can be quite helpful. And then having a draft motion ready for them, I think, is quite useful, because asking them to endorse a treaty campaign is not a request that they get very often. And so we do have some draft motions that you can then tailor to sort of the local priorities and the local voice. And then, yeah, you listed a bunch of great organizations. And so I think in some ways, like, trust yourself to know who has credibility locally, and then talk to them. Like there's some generic advice that can be useful, but political contexts change so much in so many different places. And so I would say, yeah, like some of the like broad strokes, key things that are helpful is an ally in the city council, making sure that you know what questions might get asked and having someone who can speak to those questions and knowing who has credibility locally and then having them be a part of the conversation.
That's super helpful, Rachel. Thank you so much. Yeah, always love to hear the different tactics. And I think, yeah, having someone that can champion it. It sounds like you're in a pretty good spot, Donna, to get things up and going. So, yeah, with that, thank you so much for answering all of our many questions. We are just going to move on to the community call portion of this call. This is just meant to be a space that is intentionally designed for members across our network to connect, amplify, and share opportunities or ideas and problem solve together. So with that, the community call portion is pretty loose, I would say, but I'm just going to drop a guiding question in the chat, which is there something you're working on or planning that others might be able to support, collaborate on, or learn from? And we can just get folks to either unmute or raise their hand or put what they're working on in the chat. One of the pieces that really kind of resonated with me as you were presenting, Rachel, was about the Make Polluters Pay campaigns and the different ways that people have been getting involved there. I know, not to put you on the spot, Dora, but I know that a lot of folks in BC have been really active and have seen some big winnings from the Sue Big Oil campaign. So I'm curious about, yeah, I'm just curious about if there's any updates on that front.
Sadly, I really have no updates on the Sue Big Oil campaign. That's unfortunate. I know they've been active here at our Draw the Line and other
Hmm.
things going on. I will say though that I was just like hours ago listening to the podcast from the Calgary Climate Hub, which is exactly about making polluters pay, or in this case, the oil and gas industry pay. It was great. It was really informative. But I don't have any information specifically to BC and Sue Big Oil.
Fair enough. I feel like there's been a lot with which is oh my gosh, West Coast environmental. Anyways, um, they're not working on or planning to work on the Sue Big Oil campaign slash litigation. Do you have any additional information on that, Margot? Oh, East Coast environmental law. I was confused. I thought you were on the East Coast, and I was like, I thought Sue Big Oil was happening. Anyways, do you have any more information on that, Margot, and what kind of happened with that? Oh,
Hi. No, other than when I started reading about the uh, West Coast environmental law,
mhm.
I immediately sent an email to the East Coast to say, "Are you thinking about this? Is this something that you would get involved in?" And they said no. So that might be maybe something we could work on, getting them engaged in the campaign.
Yeah, I'm familiar with how, I guess, like connected West Coast environmental law and East Coast environmental law associations are. It doesn't really seem like there's a lot of
You're
overlap, perhaps.
yes, I think you're right. But this involves New Brunswick has got the biggest oil refinery in the north on the northeast. Uh, sorry, you know what I mean on the in the
Hmm.
northeast. So yeah, we should probably maybe think about approaching them or at least putting a bug in their ear. One of their lawyers lives in Fredericton.
Well, it seems like, yeah, I think putting a bug in their ear is definitely a good step. And I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of lessons to be learned from how Sue Big Oil has kind of fanned out in the West. And so
Mhm.
hopefully we can take some of those lessons and apply them on the East. Do you think there's another law association that might be able to like champion a similar
Well,
initiative?
environmental defense or eco justice, those are the only two other organizations I know about that do these types of things on a regular basis.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I hear you. Well, I guess like now that we're in the vein of Fredericton, I know that Fredericton's been pretty busy over the past couple of months or 6 months or so. Do you want to share maybe some of the work that the hub has been doing in relation to some of the trash stuff?
I can do that. Kind of gets us off the sort of the main purpose of this, which I was going to just speak to, in that,
Yeah, go for it.
yeah, the Fredericton Community Climate Hub is is we have had a meeting and discussed partnering with other organizations to create awareness, create pressure, etc. Um, uh, with a view to having municipal council, of which I am a part, actually, candidly, speak to this. And, I think it may take a few attempts to get it through municipal council, but
Hmm.
the more pressure we can generate within the community, and it has to be outside organizations and speaking to their own local councillors. So other than that, yes, we've been busy with a zero food waste household project over the summer, where we got 22 households to deliberately measure their avoidable food waste. And then we picked it up and weighed it. And then we provided them with helpful tips and tricks every week. And then we saw whether those had an impact. And they filled out a questionnaire at the end. And we're in the process of doing a final report on that. So if anybody is interested, send me your email. I'll put my email into the chat, and yeah, you can get in touch with me. And we're in the midst of applying for grants and so on. So it's kind of a in limbo time of year, but it's all good.
Hmm. It's all good. Yeah, I am so looking forward to reading that report and also hopefully finding tips and tricks for how I can myself reduce my household waste because
You are.
that's definitely something that's always top of mind for me. It's hard when you don't have a car. I feel like that is the one of the things because I feel like I'm always like I want to buy in bulk and reduce that packaging, but hard
Yeah.
to carry it. Um, but hopefully that balances out in some ways, me not having a car versus that. But yeah, that is to say, I really look forward to seeing that report, and I'll definitely make sure that we share it within the network. Do you have any, are there any, maybe spoiler insights that you could maybe share? Did people really enjoy the exercise or?
Yes, they did. And we had a final meeting where we invited people, and we didn't think it was going to be very long, but they took 2 hours. Were so enthusiastic. They were just so happy that someone had reached out to them and
Mhm.
asked them to become involved. And I thought it was a really good sort of first kick at the can. That was our first project that we did. And yeah, I mean, I hope it's an entree to other different types of citizen engaged endeavors by the Climate Hub, maybe focusing on plastics. That's
Mhm.
one of our things in our crosshairs right now. So
Mhm.
yeah,
Has that's great. I mean, I would love to once that report comes out, write a blog post and have it amplified on climate reality. So we might have someone getting in touch with you to do a little interview on that because yeah, it's a great story.
perfect.
Um, yes, of course. I guess as we're running to the end of our call, oh, Maddie, they successfully passed zero carbon step code for new builds, but a by-election changed the council. New members chose to hold a new vote. Oh, and cancel the zero carbon step code. That is really unfortunate. That is really unfortunate news coming out of Cowichan. I'm really sorry to hear that. Do you know, are the new counselors at all interested in, yeah, hearing from the Cowichan Climate Hub again now that they're newly elected? has there been any success getting a meeting with those newly elected councilors? Maybe I'll follow up with you via email, Maddie. Alrighty. Oh, waiting until the fall elections in 2026. Right on. Well, it seems like you've got a year to prepare for that. So do get in touch with me if you'd like any support from Climate Reality Project Canada, especially since it's coming from the Cowichan Climate Hub. Definitely happy to support in that and make sure that yeah, it's so unfortunate that it passed and they undid it. That is not great news. And I would hate to really end the call on that note, but if there aren't any other big updates that anyone would like to share with the group, Catherine or John, if you have any projects that are currently underway that might be relevant, please feel free to put your hands up. Otherwise, I can go ahead and move to start closing the call. Pausing. Alrighty. Thank you so much, Hannah, for dropping the relevant links in the chat. Just so that folks are aware, Climate Reality is hosting a webinar on November 19th on participatory democracy, and we'll be talking with the Toronto Residents Reference Panel on inclusive climate action. So do feel free to register for that. Catherine, I see you just came off of on camera. Is there anything you'd like to share? Oh, can I unmute you from my end? Oh, yeah.
There.
There we go.
I don't
Technology.
really have an update, but I just wanted to pop on and say hello, and that it's this is my first call that I've been able to participate in, and it's nice to be part of the community. So thank you.
Yeah, and where are you coming from, Catherine?
I'm coming from Cape Breton.
Right
So
on.
a lot of the work that I'm involved with is dealing with noise pollution and greenhouse gas pollution from a coal mine, the only subsea coal mine in the world, and the only active coal mine in Nova Scotia.
And you've been doing some incredible work on that.
Thank you.
I'm going to go ahead and share our latest blog post that is highlighting some of the work that Catherine's been doing as the Cow Bay Environmental Coalition.
Thanks. Yeah.
It's always really hard for me to get links while I'm zooming, but popping it in the chat here. There we go. And with that, Catherine, welcome to the Community Climate Hub Network. So
Thank
happy to
you.
have you on.
Thanks.
And once again, thank you for all the action and advocacy you've taken in your local community. I'm sure folks are much better off for it.
Well, thank you.
And as we close the call, like I said, we're hosting a webinar on November 19th. So if you're interested in learning more about participatory democracy and inclusive climate action, I encourage you all to go ahead and register for that webinar. I'll also be sending out a follow-up email to all those who have registered for this call so that all of the relevant resources. And just so that folks are aware, these national community calls are going to probably continue rolling out in the new year. Ideally, once a month is the hope, but we've got a lot of big transitions happening at Climate Reality Project right now. So it might happen in February or March. And just to wrap it up, thank you so much for coming on this call, everyone. And I hope you have a really good rest of your day.
Bye.